Good afternoon, everyone. So science and the Bible, when people say these two things, often they talk about them conflicting, that somehow science and the Bible can't be aligned, that they don't agree. Now, I'm interested in science, I'm interested in the Bible. So when people say things that, religion and the Bible that it comes from go in different directions, it makes me interested. Because the basis for my religion is the Bible, and I also have an interest in science. So when scientists say things like this is a quote from a scientist called Peter Atkins, who wrote, he's a chemist, he wrote a couple of the chemistry textbooks I used at university. He said there's no compatibility between science and religion. So they're totally different. And he says, actually, religion is the antithesis of science. So you don't need religion. It's completely against science, he says. It's science can answer all your questions. All the deep questions of existence are answered by science. So you don't need religion, any religion, he would say. Certainly you don't need the Bible, because science has got everything you need in it, everything you need to answer questions for today's world. And statements like this are not unique to this professor. It's an increasing worldview that you'll see on the TV and radio and newspapers and on the internet. This worldview that science can explain all things, that science has got rid of the need for religion and got rid of the need for the Bible. So what we're going to do this afternoon is challenge that worldview. We're going to challenge statements like this and see that actually they are not correct. So the way we're going to do this, the things we're going to answer 4 questions. We're going to answer, are science and religion opposed? Has science done away with religion? What does the Bible say about this, and what does science have to say about this? They're the 4 questions. This is the backbone of our talk, hence the little corny x-ray in the bottom right-hand corner. So when you come back to this slide and you see that x-ray of a backbone, you'll know we're back on our backbone slide, and we're going to fill the answers as we go. So you'll know how near we are to the end as well as we start to fill in the answers. So what we're going to do, as a bit of an introduction, is we're going to do something that science has not yet been able to do, and we're going to time travel. So we're going to go back in our minds to around about the 16th century, and let's pretend for a moment that we are in that time. What would it be like? Well, if we're sitting in this room looking at the Bible, and you've all got Bibles on your laps or under your chairs, we'd be in trouble. We'd probably be arrested. Our lives may well be in danger because we've got English Bibles, and that was illegal at that time. And actually we're going to be discussing things to do with science. So we might even mention that the Earth goes around the sun and not the other way around. So that we'd have been in trouble for that as well in the 16th century. So let's move on from this time, because it's not a nice place to be if you're a Bible believer and if you're interested in science as well. Now, if you come on a couple hundred years later, you're in a much more tolerant worldview, because actually the reason for that is people have actually started to read the Bible. Thanks to people like William Tyndale and changes in the way the government of this country and the way it's split away from the Catholic Church, we're actually allowed to read the Bible in English. And everyone's interested in the Bible in this part of history in this country. And actually science is advancing as well, because people are beginning to discover things and challenge some of the old ideas. And it's a really interesting period of history for scientists. So this is a very famous mathematician, German mathematician, Johannes Kepler. And he said this, he said, the chief aim of all investigations of the external world should be to discover the rational order and harmony which has been imposed on it by God, and which he revealed to us in the language of mathematics. So that's what a scientist's job is. A scientist's job is to find out everything that God has already created, everything that God has put to work in the universe, and he speaks to us through mathematics. That's quite a long quote from this chap. This is a lovely little phrase that he used. He said that science is thinking God's thoughts after him. So God has a thought, God designs something, God creates something, God puts laws into action, and a scientist thinks about those things after God has done it. A lovely little summary of what this period of history thought science was. So these are Kepler's laws of the planetary motion. So that he used mathematics to describe how the heavenly bodies, as they would then be called, move. And he thought, his view was that these laws, and the fact that he could work out all these laws, would indicate to him that someone had made those laws. And that's certainly what he thought as a scientist. He thought that he just discovered everything that God had put into place at the time of creation. So that was Kepler. There's another scientist who Wikipedia, of all places, says is the most influential scientist in history, and that is Isaac Newton. And he's around about the same time. And he says this most beautiful system of the sun, the planets and the comets could only proceed from the counsel and dominion of an intelligent and powerful being. So when he looked at the universe, his view as a scientist was that there's no other way this could have come about, that this could have such beauty and have such order. It must have been designed. That was his view. And as a result, he said this, which nowadays would go down like a lead balloon, wouldn't it? Atheism, he says, atheism is senseless. Atheism is odious. And as a result, there haven't been many atheists, is what he's saying. Now, that was Isaac Newton's view back in the day. He said it doesn't make any sense to not believe in God. Why would anyone do that? Now, Newton, you may or may not know, he wrote more about the Bible than he did about science. He was someone who, his Christianity and his science, for him, they completely went hand in hand. They were absolutely connected. So it's quite an interesting place to be, but we're going to have to come on to the future, to the present day. And, well, where are we now? Well, actually, belief in the Bible has plummeted. According to the last census in the UK, the people actively participating in religion more than halved in the last 50 years. But at the same time, over those 50 years, scientific understanding has massively increased, hasn't it? So we've now got, we've put a man on the moon, we've got the internet, we've got mobile phone communication, we've got computer chips, we can transplant organs, we've got amazing medical advances. And also negative things that science has given us, things like nuclear weapons development, that sort of thing. So as science has increased and flourished, biblical knowledge and religion has decreased. Now, have those two things, is one the result of the other? Is that Peter Atkins, professor, that we spoke about a bit, is he right by saying because science has developed, we don't need the Bible anymore, and that's the reason the understanding of the Bible has decreased? Now, these are questions that need answering. But what we're going to do first is just redress the balance and remind ourselves that not all scientists agree with people like Professor Atkins or people like Richard Dawkins, who's written a book called The God Delusion, where he tries to show that science now is showing that God is just a myth, God is just a delusion. So not all scientists agree with them. So this is a chap called Francis Collins. He was the leader of the Human Genome Project. So one of the greatest scientific achievements of the last kind of 30 years is sequencing the human genome. So this is the code that sits within the DNA in all of our trillions of cells in our body. It's a phenomenal scientific achievement. Francis Collins led the project. This is his kind of CV as a scientist, you'd be pretty pleased, wouldn't you, if that was on your CV? That, you know, he's a medical doctor, but then has advanced to leading a number of national bodies in the States. And he wrote a book called The Language of God about his sort of scientific journey, but also about how he moved from being an atheist as a kind of student, medical student, how he developed a faith in Christianity. And he said about this wonderful scientific achievement of sequencing the human genome, he said, for me, that experience, he said, which uncovered the most remarkable of all texts, so our code in our bodies, he said, is the most remarkable thing you could read, is a stunning scientific achievement and an occasion of worship. Because he, like Kepler, was saying, well, we found the amazing complexity of how the human body works, and actually, doesn't that just show that there is a God behind it all, a designer behind it all? So back to our backbone. Are science and religion opposed? Well, some people think they are. So Atkins, Dawkins, a number of scientists you would meet today would say they are. But there are scientists throughout history who still exist today that say no. Their science and their religion, particularly their Christian religion, go hand in hand. One supports the other, and their Christianity encourages them to look into this world, to find out more about the God that created it. So let's think about our second question. Has science done away with religion? And that was what Peter Atkins said, wasn't it? Science is competent to answer all the deep questions of existence. Is that true? Well, we've all been given a mind. Scientists an atheist would say that's just come about because of millions of years of development. A believer would say it's because God has created it. If we use that mind and think about that question, science is competent to answer all the deep questions of existence. It's very obviously wrong, isn't it? There are plenty of questions that we can probably all think of that science cannot answer. So, for example, how should I behave as a human being? How should I act morally? Why am I here? What happens when I die? Things that science cannot investigate. All of these things are deep questions that science cannot answer. So this is a quote from a scientist. So this is a Nobel Prize winning scientist, a biologist, Sir Peter Medawar. He won the Nobel Prize for Medicine. And he disagrees with that first scientist, Peter Atkins. He says that there is a limit upon science is made very likely by the existence of questions that science cannot answer, and no conceivable advance of science would empower it to answer. So just what we said. And his questions he thinks of is, how did everything begin? What are we all here for? What's the point of living? Those are not questions that science can answer. So science cannot answer all the deep questions of existence. There's a picture of a cake. So there's an author called John Lennox who wrote a very good book that I would recommend called God's Undertaker, it's called. Has Science Buried God? And he describes the limits of science by using the example of a cake. And he says, this is my Aunt Matilda's cake. And I could give that cake to the world's leading scientists, and they will be able to tell you lots about that cake. A physicist will be able to tell you about the atomic particles that make up that cake. A chemist will be able to tell you all the chemical changes that went through when that cake was being baked. A nutritionist will be able to tell you if you ate that, what that cake would do to you, how it would interact with your body. They could analyse that cake left, right and centre, but they would not be able to tell you through their scientific work on that cake why his aunt made the cake. They wouldn't be able to say that the aunt had made a cake for someone's birthday party. They wouldn't be able to tell you why they'd done it. And his point is, he says, when it comes to questions of meaning, purpose and value, science is blind. And it's not a criticism, it's simply about recognising and respecting its limits. His point is that science answers the how questions. How do things work? That's the point of science. It does not answer the why questions. Why are we here? Why was the cake made in the first place? And so Lennox, Medawar, that we just talked about earlier on, these are both scientists that say science can answer certain things, but it has a boundary and it cannot answer everything. You need other disciplines like philosophy and religion to try and think about these other things. So has science done away with religion? No, absolutely not. I think that's relatively simple to show because science has limits to what it is able to answer. So let's think about what the Bible has to say about all this. So to introduce what the Bible has to say, we're going to quote from Richard Dawkins, who is probably one of the most, he's been less prevalent in the media over the last few years because he's been in ill health. But he's one of the most prominent critics of religion in general and specifically the Bible. And this is what he says about faith. He says faith, which he describes as belief that is not based on evidence, is the principal vice of any religion. So that's what's wrong with religion, because all these people who believe in religion have faith and they have no evidence for it. That's what he thinks. He says science is not religion and it doesn't come down to faith. Science is based upon facts, verifiable evidence. So science is free of the main vice of religion, which is faith. So he's saying two things in kind of repeating them a little bit in that. He's saying faith is not based on evidence and science is free from faith. Now, Dawkins is one of the sort of most prominent and respected and leading scientists of the last 50 years. So, I would always respectfully challenge someone like that. And respectfully, we're going to say, actually, both those statements are wrong, and they're provably wrong, and we're going to do that now. So let's think about the first one. Faith isn't based on evidence. Well, if we were to open our Bibles, we're going to all the verses are going to be on the screen, but feel free to have a look in your Bibles. We would see that the Bible is a book of faith. The Bible, right from the very beginning, in the beginning, God, it demands that you believe in God. It demands you have faith. And Hebrews says that you have to have faith to please God. That's what that verse says. So it demands you have faith, correct. But the Bible absolutely does not want you to have a faith that is not based on evidence. The Bible faith is based on evidence. In the book of Proverbs, that great wisdom book in the middle of the Bible says, the simple believe anything. A simple person, a foolish person, will just believe whatever you tell him. A wise person, a prudent person, thinks about his steps. The Gospels, the four Gospels in the New Testament, the last one, John, was written, and John the writer says, I've written all of this to give you some evidence that you might believe. So it's not that faith just is something we have as some kind of quality. We read the Bible in order to have that belief and faith. And belief and faith, the same thing, the same word in the Greek. We're told to prove, to test all things in the New Testament. Don't just believe what you're told. Think about the evidence. Paul, one of the leading first century preachers, went into the Sabbath to preach to the Jews, and he went there and reasoned. So sometimes people think, people portray religion and the Bible as being free from reason and thought. And it's not. He went there and he debated and he used arguments and evidence and reason. So the faith of the Bible is based on evidence. The evidence within the Bible itself and the evidence we can see. I'm going to think about that from God's creation as well. If I had no evidence for believing in God, if I did not have an argument that I could articulate to you, I wouldn't believe. So my faith is certainly based on reason and evidence. So Dawkins is not correct when he says that faith is not based on evidence. He also said another thing. He said, well, science is completely different, and science is free from faith. So all of these people who are being religious, they have a faith that isn't based on evidence, but the scientists have a faith that is based on evidence only. Again, respectfully, I'd say that he's not correct. So this is a quote from The Blind Watchmaker, one of Darwin's books Dawkins's books on evolution. And he says it's thoroughly believable that every organ or apparatus that we see is a product of small changes. So that's what Darwinian evolution is, that organisms can advance from being simple to being more complicated. They can advance into different species through passing on successive mutations and developing through very small changes into other different species. And he says it's thoroughly believable, he says. Now that's the language of faith, isn't it? That's the language, as a quote from the same person who says that science is free from faith and belief. This is also a quote from The Blind Watchmaker about how the very first replicating molecule formed. So for life to begin, it must have started off with non-life. So there must be some molecules that kind of started reproducing and replicating, probably is a better word to use, until you got some life. And science doesn't know how that happened. And he's written a couple of pages on what he thinks was the way those molecules came together in the first beginning. Now, obviously, you can't read his argument, because what I've done is taken out all of his arguments and left in the words that he used. And he talks about this probably happened. This seems likely. So these are all his words that he used in about 2 pages. So there's about 10, isn't there, on that screen of words that are to do with faith and belief and probably, and this is not evidence. So he's written a scientific book that's full of these sorts of words. Okay? So science is clearly not free from faith. There are examples of science science is just like the Bible in terms of it demands faith based on evidence. The Bible presents information, and we make a decision based on the evidence we see. Science presents information, we make a decision based on the evidence we see. To say from the outset that I'm not going to involve God is restricting science, because you're saying I'm going to be an atheist irrespective of what the evidence tells me. Whereas the right attitude is to look at all the evidence, whether it be in the world around us or in the Bible, and say, I will follow the evidence wherever it takes me, irrespective of the conclusion. When it comes down to it, atheism, being an atheist, is a faith just as much as believing in God is a faith, because neither can be proved scientifically. Both look at the evidence and make a decision. An atheist looks at the evidence, makes a decision. A person who's religious looks at the evidence and makes a decision. They're both faith-based systems. So let's not fall into the trap of thinking that scientists are, or an atheist scientist just looks at the facts and is completely free from faith. That isn't the case. They look at the evidence and they make a decision, a faith-based decision, that they will not believe in God. What we're going to do now is just look at 2 scientific questions, and just to answer our last question, we're going to look at 2 little scientific questions, or they're not little, 2 big scientific questions, and we will see how science has attempted to answer those with theories, but we'll also see that a legitimate answer to those questions is that God was involved. A legitimate evidence-based answer is that God was involved. So the first question we're going to look at is, why is the universe just right? And the second one is, how did life begin? Okay, these are, people have been debating these since the beginning of time, haven't they? So we're going to spend a couple of minutes on each. But we're going to look at these and think, what does science have to say? And where does the evidence take us? So the universe is just right for us to exist in it. And the planet Earth is just right for us to exist in it. So that's led some scientists to call it the Goldilocks enigma. You remember is it a fairy story, or the fairy tale of Goldilocks? She wanted something that was just right, didn't she? She ate the porridge of I've forgotten the story, the big bear and the medium bear, and the little bear's porridge was just right. So the universe is like that. It's just right for life. So Paul Davies, who's a British physicist, has written a book called The Goldilocks Enigma. Why is the universe just right for life? And he says, look, there's over 100 things to do with the planet Earth that need to be right in order to have life. Okay, so there's an enormous probability of that happening. But then you can go even further than that, and he says, look, there are 4 fundamental forces that hold all the universe together. And if those forces had just been infinitesimally different, the universe wouldn't even exist. So the universe is extremely unlikely to have existed, and the planet Earth is extremely unlikely to have provided life for us. So that's led people like Davies to say the impression of design is overwhelming, because there's no way that you could just have what we've got just by chance. And that universe that is extremely unlikely to even exist has laws and orders that we can understand. You know, we can look at it and it works like clockwork, and we can predict what would happen and do experiments. So we're saying that the likelihood of this universe the universe coming into being is so tiny, and it's originated in a way in which we can understand and measure and calculate and predict. That's quite incredible. And that's led scientists like Hawkins, who wasn't a religious person. He says, the more we discover about the universe, the more we find it's governed by rational laws. You know, they're laws that we can understand. So let's look at the evidence and we say, right, we've got this universe that shouldn't really exist because it's so unlikely to have happened, and it functions according to rational law. How did it get there? Now we could say, well, it just happened, and that's an opinion. But I think if you look at the evidence, it's much more likely to have been created by someone who put all of that unlikely universe together and who made it function according to law and order. They're both opinions. I think the opinion that God created it is looking at the evidence in a much more detailed way than just thinking, well, it just happened. And that's led many people today who don't believe in God to say, well, what there is, there's actually millions of universes, an infinite number of universes, and that's the way they get round having one that is just good enough. But don't be fooled into thinking that believing in many different universes is any more scientific than believing in God, as if that's a good reason and believing in God isn't. We look at the evidence and we form a conclusion, and I think it's much more credible to believe that God created it. So what about life? How did life begin? Well, science doesn't know how life began. There are lots of theories. So on the screen there is a list of all the different theories. Dawkins believes, or certainly when he wrote The Blind Watchmaker, believed in what's called the clay hypothesis. So that's the idea that little bits of, I mean, it's obviously more complicated than this, but little kind of crystals of clay eventually stuck together, started forming in a way, formed a molecule, etc., and eventually got life. Now, these theories, none of them have been proved. Remember what Dawkins said about in his theory, there were lots of potentialities and probablys in there, it might actually do it and that sort of thing. But years ago, near the time when Dawkins wrote The Blind Watchmaker, people thought that the life was quite simple. So in 1967, which isn't that long ago, people said, well, within 10 years, we'll be making cells in laboratories. We'll be making them. We'll be able to manufacture cells. I mean, no one would ever dream of saying that now, because people know how complicated a human or a living cell is. You know, what they call the simple cell is, I work in a factory, it's basically a factory. It's a factory that can make itself and make other factories. You know, these things don't just happen. So the living cell has about as much information as 100 million pages in an encyclopedia. It's an absolutely phenomenally complex thing. People have tried to calculate the probability of it happening. And these numbers, they're not even real numbers. You know, people say the probability is 1 in 10 with 40,000 noughts on. That's not a number, right? That's impossible. That is That is many, many more times than there are actually atoms in the universe. So a single cell is not going to happen by chance scientifically. So if we're going to be scientists, if we're going to think logically about something, and we see a single cell with its complexity within it, we see this tiny little factory that you have trillions of in your body, that started out from 2 cells and that knew what to turn into and created you, are we really going to say that all of that came from nothing by chance? And within our cells is the DNA. So DNA is a code that sits within each of the cell nuclei. And it's like a computer code. It's like a computer code that can replicate itself, that can fix itself. It's a computer code that can make other computers. It's something that is far more complex than human beings have ever been able to imagine producing. So where did all that information come from? Now, when we see information, we acknowledge that someone has designed that information. So we've probably all got a box of Scrabble at home. We may never play it, but we've probably got one in a cupboard somewhere, haven't we? If we found that we'd come down in the morning and the Scrabble box was on the floor and it had written something, a couple of words on the carpet, well, if we lived on our own, we'd probably be a bit frightened, because we would think that's come from an intelligent mind. Someone has written those words in the Scrabble pieces. We wouldn't expect, if we dropped Scrabble on the floor, that it would write some words, okay? Because we see information and we think that's come from an intelligence. If we found a stone with this sort of thing on in our garden, when we were doing some gardening, even if we didn't know, even if we can't read Egyptian hieroglyphics, which I'm sure, well, I certainly can't, and if you can, I'd be incredibly impressed and like to talk to you later. Even if we can't read them, we look at these repeating pictures and we think that's definitely being written down by a human being. There's no way I would ever believe that's been written down by chance, or by an ant, or by wind kind of eroding a rock. We wouldn't believe anyone who said that's not come from a human being. Because we see information and we believe it has a designer. And the final example that shows that is this: there's something called SETI, which is the search for extraterrestrial life and intelligence, there are people who are listening to radio frequencies from outer space, and they're listening for sequences. They are listening to see whether or not they can hear signs of intelligence. And if there was a repeated pattern coming from the stars, or some sort of sequence, then people would declare there's intelligent life out there. That's what would happen. So why, when we look at our bodies, when we see the cells within not just us, but all living things, that incidentally are all based on the same model, they're all based on DNA, and if we look at that DNA, see that information within it, why do we think, oh, that just happened? That hasn't been guided. That's just come about over millions of years, or it just developed itself. It doesn't make any sense. It makes a lot more sense to think somebody designed that information. The life, the human, the cell, the living cell. I love this quote. It's this biochemist who's relatively famous in the field of challenging Darwinian evolution. He said that, is it credible that random processes could have constructed a reality that the smallest element of which, the cell, is complex beyond our own creative capacities, which excels in every sense anything produced by the intelligence of man. So there isn't anything. We might be wowed by what our phones can do, by when we see programs about what doctors can do nowadays. It's incredible. But the cells that are thinking in your mind about those things far exceed in complexity anything that man has ever produced and ever will produce. Yet an atheist is quite prepared to just accept that just happened. So, what does science have to say? Well, why is the universe just right? Why did life begin? There are scientific theories for both those things. But I think one theory that certainly agrees with the evidence is that God created the universe and God created life. It certainly agrees with the evidence when you look at it. Which is really interesting because, just to finish, this is exactly the position that this man came to. Now, I wouldn't have known who he was if I put the photo up and showed me. This is a chap called Professor Antony Flew. And he died in 2010, and he was one of the leading atheists of the, what century are we now? Of the 20th century. And he was kind of the sort of leading light. So he did a lot of debates with C.S. Lewis. So back in the sort of Oxford, in the sort of to middle of last century, C.S. Lewis was a prominent Christian author. Lots of debates with this chap about the existence of God. But in 2007, he wrote this book, which shocked a lot of people because it was called There Is a God. And he said he has decided to change his view and not be an atheist and become a theist, someone who felt that there was something behind it all. And there were two reasons he gave in his book. And one is the two things we've been looking at. The order is so fine-tuned. The universe is so fine-tuned. He says there had to be an intelligence behind the complexity of the universe. There's got to be intelligence behind it. And life, he says, it's been shown by the almost unbelievable complexity of the arrangements which are needed to produce life. Intelligence must have been involved. It's simply out of the question that the first living matter evolved out of dead matter. And this is someone and he says this, he says, I did not hear a voice. He's not had a kind of road to Damascus experience where he suddenly felt, that he should be a believer. He said he looked at the evidence and followed the evidence to the conclusion, which is what all good scientists should do. So, I'd just like to leave us with a Bible verse, because this is what the Bible's been saying all along. So, if, as well as the Bible describing creation in the Old Testament, one of the books in the New Testament, Romans, says, since the creation of the world, God's invisible qualities, his eternal power and divine nature, have been clearly seen, being understood from what he has made. So when people like Newton and Kepler could look out at the universe, they were absolutely amazed and said, look, how could all of these wonderful things that work like clockwork, they must have God behind them. And then you've got people like Francis Collins and Antony Flew latterly, who've looked at the sun, and Michael Denton and people like that, who looked at the sun and said, look, that complexity, those trillions of tiny little factories that make up your body that you don't even have to think about, there's no way they've come from non-life. God is clearly seen, being understood from what he has made. So we can answer our final question. Well, the origin of the universe, life itself, has been explained by science. So it hasn't been explained by science. There are theories. But one theory that has a lot of evidence to back it up is creation by God. And as we've said all along, we just finished now, a good scientist should follow the evidence wherever it takes you. You shouldn't say, right, God is completely out of the question, I'm going to stay in this box that doesn't have God in it, and I won't go outside of that. You follow the evidence. And for me, the evidence strongly suggests that God exists, which is why I believe he does. And as I've looked into the Bible, then my faith has been increased. When you look at things like prophecies fulfilled in the Bible, his caring hand in my life, answers to prayer, it only strengthens my faith. So hopefully we've been able to think about God, about how science is not opposed to him and actually can sit quite comfortably alongside it, as it did for people like Newton and Collins. And hopefully our faith has been increased a little bit. And I'll just leave you with one quote, which is a quote I really like. It's a quote that's attributed to another Nobel Prize winner for physics, beginning of last century. And he says, science and religion are opposed. But then he puts his little spin on it. He says, they are opposed, but only in the same way as my thumb and forefinger are opposed. And between them, I can grasp everything. And if we look at the Bible, if we look at God's creation around us, we can really grasp and understand about him and his plan for this earth. Thank you.